Okay, this is part two of the presentation on qualitative continuums as an approach to understanding feminist qualitative methods, the Ellingson reading. This is the only thing of mine that I'm having you read this quarter, other than looking at some of my data for particular exercises. This is on page 597 and 598 of your reading, the excerpt that you did from that larger chapter. And I'm going to use that table. It's called Figure 36.1, the qualitative continuum, and I'm going to, it goes on for 2 pages. I'm going to go all the way down the right or science realist side, and then I'm going to swing over to the art impressionist side to contrast that, and then I will go through the middle. So I'm going to go down through, if you look all the way on the left, there's goals, questions, and methods, and then on the next page, again on the left, there's writing, researcher, vocabularies, and criteria, and I'm going to go through each of those categories on the science side, each of those categories on the art and impressionist, and then each in the middle ground. Okay? All right, on the art and science side, the goals of the research are very much similar to um, the doing quantitative research. They're either positivist or only slightly post-positivist, right? A little bit flexible from there. Still focused on finding objective truth, still focused on generalizing. The kinds of questions that they ask, right, which are hypotheses, are done from the researcher's point of view, which is shaped by theory, right? And they're interested in predicting and controlling behavior. Therefore, the kind of methods they use are very precise, and they usually end up not just putting codes on certain kinds of qualitative data, but then often counting. That's what frequencies are, which is on here, frequencies of behaviors. They're trying to code or look at very specific elements of the qualitative data, and then they often count how frequently each of those different kinds of code shows up in the data. So they're, in essence, converting qualitative data into quantitative data. They also do very structured kinds of data collection. All right, the writing on the science side of the continuum uses passive voice, the idea of the data were collected, the interviews were conducted, the data were analyzed, when actually, of course, that is not how it works. People were involved. But the writing by people doing this kind of research is as though um, it says where it says researcher, right? The researcher is presented as irrelevant to the results. Now, as feminist social constructionists, we don't believe that. We believe no matter what kind of research you're doing, the researcher is involved. So you can go and tell Dr. Boren, if you have him for quantitative methods, I love him, but he's just wrong about lots of things. You can go and tell him that the researcher may be presented as irrelevant, but of course that is not true. Anyway, on the far side of it, I love to tease Dr. Boren, and he loves to tease me right back. So if you do have him, feel free to give him a hard time and tell him that I don't agree with him. Anyway, the researchers presented as irrelevant as though they were able to be completely objective. Therefore, the vocabulary is different. Positivism is the key word. We already learned that in chapter 1, but deductive, which we also learned, right? And then these very, very precise ideas. Again, very much focused on the same things as quantitative research. And then, of course, the criteria that we use is very specific, very, very inflexible, and very much similar to how we judge the quality of quantitative research. Okay, now, let's contrast that idea, that way of very sciencey kinds of making sense of qualitative data, to the very artsy or impressionist side. Okay? Art and impressionist research has very different goals. They're not trying to generalize anything. They're trying to look at the specific, and they're often trying to generate very meaningful artwork that comes out of people's experience, but is not the kind of trying to be objective representation. Instead, it openly celebrates the fact that it is interpreting. The kind of questions that are asked are about how we can imagine and what is unique and special, and what are the particulars of what happened, and how can we better cope with difficult things in life. The methods that we use are much more impressionist. They are much more openly celebrating and aware of and acknowledging that they're interpreting the world, that there isn't just one way to understand things. Autoethnography, we learned about in chapter 1. Um, uh, Doing ethnography, but primarily on your own experiences. Also, interactive interviewing, where you and the interviewee end up talking with each other back and forth, and they ask you questions and you answer them. And then a lot of focus on various kinds of artwork. The writing on the left side of the continuum, on the artsy side, is first person. I collected the data. I had this experience. Let me tell you what I did in that in the story, right? We often use literary techniques and other kinds of artistic techniques, which is to say that we try to write true stories, short stories, as though they were fictional ones, in the sense that we try to use the same kind of things they do: character, plot, theme, beautiful language, really engaging forms of writing. The researcher then is either can be the main focus, as in autoethnography, or it can be a focus that's equally on the participants and on the researcher and how they're working together and making sense of things together. So the researcher is not only not irrelevant, they're very, very relevant. They can even be the focus of the research. The vocabulary is different on this artistic and interpretive end. Inductive research is important. It's very much about personal and in-depth details, very thick description, and a lot of focus on creativity and aesthetics. And then the criteria are very much what's focused on for art. Is it beautiful aesthetically? Does it ring true? Does it move me emotionally, right? Does it teach me something about the world, which is, of course, what all great books and short stories do. Okay, so that's the far opposite. That's the very other end. And if you picture this continuum, if you picture the end, the artistic end being just about 10% of that far end of the continuum, and then science is about 10% of that far end of the continuum, then there's a whole other 80% of the continuum is middle ground, meaning you can be, sort of, mostly science, about halfway between art and science, some of both. You could have a little bit more science or a little bit more art. There's a lot of flexibility for how you actually position yourself in the middle ground, which is where I mostly do my work. In the middle, the goal is to discover is to co-create patterns. It's to say, this is what's typical. No, we're not saying it's generalizable, but we're saying when we hung out with these people or we interviewed these people, these are the kinds of things that kept coming up again and again. These are the patterns. The kind of questions we ask are always focused on how the participants make meaning. How do they understand their world? The methods that we use are flexible. We interview, but we do it with semi-structured. We have questions, but we also vary from those questions and follow people's train of thought. We do focus groups and ethnography, and we're often looking at narrative analysis, thematic analysis. Grounded theory means finding patterns in your data in some special ways that involve coding. So it's that kind of thing, that focus on patterns. The writing in the middle ground, also first person, right? I did this, I found this. And what you do is you make an argument, and then you get little quotes from your participants, from their interview transcripts or focus groups, or they could be things that you described about them in your ethnography. And but you also think about the person who's telling this story standpoint, and that the researcher is presented as relevant, but the participants are always the main focus in the middle ground. What do they think? With a lot of awareness on your embodied standpoint. Now, we never apologize. Do we apologize for our embodied standpoint? No. But we do take it into consideration that I, for example, am straight and I have white privilege, and I am in my early 50s, and I am heterosexual, and I have a disability that shapes how I understand the world. Right? These things really shape how I understand healthcare, which is mostly what I study. The vocabulary is very much centered on social constructionism and post-positivism, and there's sort of a range of post-positivism that's almost like positivism, and then that's a much more flexible, and it's almost like social constructionism, and then there's everything in between. Don't worry about that too much. For your purposes, we'll just talk about social constructionism and positivism. Look at the vocabulary, very much focused on inductive and focused on patterns, themes. Those are the key things here. And then the criteria are flexible, right? There's still criteria. What matters? What's quality research? But they're not rigid like on the science side, nor are they as artsy and aesthetic as they are on the, and emotional as they are on the left side. In the middle, they're about, did you do a good job co-creating patterns? A few things I'm having you read that I wrote. I think this may be the only thing I'm having you read, other than a few examples that we'll use for group work. And you're not reading all of it. If you would go to pages 597 and 598, which is where the large table is that I designed, what I want to talk to you about is, and this is all written out in the segment of the chapter that you read as well, But what I want to talk to you about is what this table says and how you can understand it. I'm going to start on the right side, which is the science or realist side, and I'm going to go all the way down. You'll notice on the left side that there are categories: goals, questions, methods, writing, researcher, vocabularies, and criteria. And I'm going to talk to you about all the science and realist side of the continuum of qualitative methods. The next step over from that would simply be quantitative methods. Right? And then I'm going to talk to you, swing all the way to the other side, and talk to you about the artistic and impressionist side, and then we'll end up in the middle briefly. But I'm going to go back and forth between the two pieces of paper because I want to go all the way down each column. So I'm going to do the science and realist column first. Okay, so basically, science and realist approaches to qualitative methods do the same thing that quantitative methods do, which is that they're trying to find generalizable facts that discover objective truths that are supposedly out there, right? That the researcher is trying to predict and control behavior. The questions that they then ask are all based on the researcher's understanding, right? They define what we can predict, what we can control, right? Very much looking at very specifically defined ideas or concepts, right? Then the types of methods that are used when you're doing this kind of qualitative is very specific types of coding, right? So textual data is data that's written out. You can make a transcript, or it could be your field notes, or it could be pieces you've downloaded off the internet from different kinds of hate groups, and you want to try to analyze the words that they, in the type of meanings that they used in their recruitment materials, right? So you could be analyzing those. It's often done through random sample. Frequencies of behaviors are things that you code for, and then you count how many of each one of the categories shows up in your data. And it's still very focused on, if not measurement, then very close to it. It's highly structured forms of methods. Going down to the next page, the writing on the right end of the continuum, right on the science and realist side, uses passive voice. Which Donna Haraway, a feminist theorist, calls the view from nowhere, and that's objectivity. The use of passive voice is the idea of saying the data were collected, the interviews were conducted by, the data was analyzed, right? And data were analyzed, sorry. And this kind of writing is very authoritative. It tends to be very dry, right? And it tends to emphasize the idea of objectivity, that the researcher is not involved, and that's the very next category. The researcher is presented as irrelevant to the results. Now, as feminist social constructionists, do we believe that the researcher is irrelevant to the results in any kind of research? Absolutely not. We don't believe that, but that is how the writing is set up on the right end of the continuum, right? And so then the vocabularies that we use, the type of words that show up there, again, sound very much like quantitative and talk about generalizability, right? And about control and prediction. The criteria that we use for analyzing the quality of research on the right side is, again, very similar to that which would be used for quantitative positivist research. And that is the key vocabulary word on that end of the continuum, by the way, is positivism and deductive, those two words. Okay, now to contrast that, let's swing all the way over to the artistic or impressionist side of the continuum. I often call it the artsy side. Either of those words is fine. The goal on the artsy side is not to do generalizable knowledge. It's to get super in depth, looking at the particular and the rich and the individual. And it's often to create something that is art, or at least that is trying to be artistic, artish, kind of arty, right? The kind of questions we ask are about coping with daily life and using our imagination and looking at uniqueness of experience. The methods are autoethnography, which you're going to be using this quarter, interactive interviewing, so not just one person interviewing another, but going back and forth, a lot of performance stuff and a lot of visual stuff. The type of writing uses first person. I collected the data. I wrote about this. Here's what I think. Okay. It often uses literary techniques, meaning that you write stories as though you were writing fiction. You're writing things that are true, but you try very hard to have character development and plot and very good descriptions that make it feel very evocative and very engaging. The researcher could be the main focus, right? Or it could be an equal focus between the researcher and participants. The researcher is not only not irrelevant, the researcher could be the whole subject or focus of the research. or it could be the researcher's interaction with particular participants, and that could be the focus. Again, the vocabulary is different. It's artistic and interpretive and inductive on the artsy end of the continuum, right? A lot of different kinds of vocabulary, often bringing in creativity and aesthetics. Aesthetics are how we judge what is beautiful. We think about aesthetics when we talk about paintings and that kind of thing. And then lastly, the criteria are not at all the same as what are used in science. It's about, do the stories ring true? Do they resonate with us? Do they engage us? Do they move us emotionally, right? Are they plausible? Are they interesting? Are they pleasing, right? Do you feel engaged with the story? Just the same way you'd ask that in an English class. Did you like this short story or not? And why or why not? Okay, so if those are the two poles of the continuum, we don't accept that there is somehow only two options. There's a middle ground to the continuum. And those little figures that you see on the table are one of my students drew them, and they're attempting to show the idea that there's lots of space in between these. I don't have a lot of space because I was publishing this in a book that was a very specific size, but I'd like you to imagine that the art, middle, and science parts of the continuum are very far apart from each other. Okay, that the middle is huge and takes up about 80% of the continuum, and then there's 10% art on one side and 10% science on the far side, and then most things are at least a little bit of the other, right? So it's mostly art with a little bit of science, or it's about half and half, or it's mostly middle ground is very much in the middle, but a little bit sciencey, right? That idea is that there's lots of room there. So the middle is constructing what are called situated knowledges, meaning socially constructed meanings. We tend to look at patterns or the typical, so not something that's generalizable, nothing that can be counted, but we do look at how things, what kind of patterns appear when we get lots of data that really appear. We construct them, but and what kind of patterns can we discern? We tend to focus a lot of in-depth description and on understanding something, on asking questions about whatever is taken for granted. So in healthcare, it's very taken for granted, for example, that the doctor has all the power in the situation. And so I asked a lot of questions. I didn't take for granted that it should be that way, right? I tried to think about and ask questions about that. The questions that we ask then, right, are very focused on how the participants understand their world and how the participants and the researcher co-construct meanings together. They're also focused on pragmatic implications, meaning what useful knowledge can we get this? Not generalizable, but useful. So for example, I studied healthcare team for 2.5 years. I followed those people around, and then I interviewed them and spent a lot of time kind of debriefing with them as well. And the idea is that this did not generate generalizable knowledge. It was only one team after all. But I got so in depth with them that I came up with lots of very practical and useful ideas that other healthcare teams could use. Not exactly the same way, of course not, but really good insights onto things that they could try and adapt for themselves. The methods then tend to be somewhere between art and science, so a lot of meaning making. So interviewing, but with some flexibility, which we call semi-structured. Doing focus groups, doing ethnography, or what's also called participant observation. Looking for patterns, thematic, metaphoric, and narrative analysis, and grounded theory. These are very middle ground forms of qualitative analysis, and they emphasize looking for patterns in the data or themes. The writing in the middle of the continuum is also first person. We tend to use little brief quotes from transcripts and descriptions from field notes to illustrate the points we make. We put the data in there, right? We make a point, and then we use excerpts from the transcripts or field notes or the things that we pulled off the internet, right? The materials from the hate groups that I mentioned earlier, right? And we put little quotes from them in order to demonstrate the point we're trying to make. In the middle, the research is not the main point. The participants are the focus of the research, but the participants' positionality, or which is another word for embodied standpoint, is important and it is acknowledged. We tend to talk about who we are. I'm female. I'm heterosexual. I have a disability. I am in my early 50s. I am. I have had a lot of experience with the healthcare system, but I'm not a healthcare provider, right? Those kinds of things are important to know when you're going to go and judge the research that somebody did in the middle The vocabulary is very much social constructionism, and post-positivism ranges from sort of what I call immediately post-positivist, just slightly left of the right side of the continuum, all the way through a very flexible post-positivism that starts to nudge up against social constructionism. This is about inductive research and very much emergent, meaning you're making themes and categories. You're trying to figure out what are the patterns in your data. That is what we do in the middle. And then the criteria tend to be flexible as well. The way we evaluate is not the same as we would the quality of something artistic or something scientific. Instead, there's a little bit of both. It's flexible. We'll talk more about criteria later.